Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part two of an ongoing series focused on endpoint protection in endpoint protection management capabilities that are part of Configuration Manager, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. This session will focus on anti-malware policies, which is one component of endpoint protection. So here's a bit of our agenda that we're going to go through. So what are anti-malware policies in Configuration Manager? Why we care about them? The requirements for them. I want to show you configuring some of this, and then briefly show you that these are in place and on a client in my environment, and then we will wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks. Before we jump into that, though, so why are we actually discussing this, right? Well, because typically endpoint protection kind of discussions, to be completely honest, it took me a while to get to doing these sessions with Config Manager, because there were some other things that I wanted to get to that seemed more along the lines of things that I wanted to present. But I always had this on my agenda because endpoint protection settings, being able to manage them through Configuration Manager or Intune, when we get to that discussion as well, really, 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 really important, right? You have Configuration Manager deployed and managing your devices in your enterprise. So why not also use it to manage endpoint protection capabilities and so on? And that's why I'm really excited actually to get this series started and so on. So really awareness of what you have. Endpoint protection is a built-in capability in many cases for the OSs that you manage. Certainly for Windows 10, some of the newer server systems for certain endpoint protection capabilities, and so on. It's built into Configuration Manager, the ability to manage it, as we'll see as we walk through this discussion and more in the series. You may have this already licensed, right? Could be potential cost savings. There are some organizations that might be spending money on a third-party solution when you have this available to you, native to the operating system, native to your management tool. Could be that you don't need to spend any more money on it. If you're an E5 licensed customer, then you own this already. Certainly check your licensing status, but certainly worth evaluating. Another reason potentially is role-based access. So there typically is a different team in many organizations that will handle security kind of configurations, which is what endpoint protection is all about. And with role-based access controls in both Configuration Manager and Intune, it's really, really easy to give them access to the Configuration Manager environment to manage these kind of security settings without having to have them see or get confused by or burdened by, if you will, whatever term, other kinds of configurations that are available in Configuration Manager or Intune, and so on. So what is the focus of our sessions like this? Well, certainly these sessions are not sessions that are focused on detailing endpoint protection capabilities in detail. These sessions are focused on detailing the Configuration Manager, in this case, capabilities to deploy settings to these devices in detail. So there's a whole section of this discussion that we aren't going to have because our focus is Configuration Manager. This section that we're omitting, very valuable still, absolutely, but it's more on the capabilities of endpoint protection, more in detail and focused on that kind of discussion versus how to configure it. And we will, to be clear, we will set the stage in each case to discuss what a various capability for an endpoint protection feature might be, just to set the context. But then we will turn our attention quickly to how we can manage that setting in Configuration Manager, or when we get to it, Intune. All right, so that said, I'm not actually going to have a discussion of what anti-malware policies what anti-malware itself is. for most IT people, pretty intuitive, right? The ability to have something like an antivirus, typically agent, on a device that will protect against malware. And anti-malware is certainly antivirus, or anti-malware and endpoint protection is certainly antivirus and a bit more, right? So I'm assuming that knowledge in this case, and just moving directly into the discussion of how to manage the anti-malware component of endpoint protection with configuration managers. So that said, what are anti-malware policies, right? Policies. So specifically, these policies that you're going to build in Configuration Manager to manage your anti-malware, which is endpoint protection, are all about protection against malware, against threats, right? Malware certainly is a threat. There are other kinds of things out there that you can also protect against with the anti-malware feature of endpoint protection. Very flexible controls in these policies in terms of scan schedules, in terms of file types and folders that you want to scan or avoid, in terms of remediation actions, in terms of templates. This one's interesting. So I'll take a brief tangent here. In the configuration manager controls for building anti-malware policies, there are 4, I think, maybe 5, I can't remember. We'll see in a minute. 4 templates that are out there that you can use to guide your configuration of these anti-malware policies, and you'll see them. I'll show you one specifically. But one of them is a configuration manager template. This is interesting because, hey, you're using configuration manager to deploy your anti-malware policies for endpoint protection. Why not use the configuration manager template to see how Microsoft would recommend configuring your anti-malware policies for configuration manager clients specifically? And so what's interesting here, and you don't have to use what we give you in a template, not at all, but from the template, you can learn kind of some configurations that might be interesting. One of them is exclusion settings and what we would exclude from real-time scanning and so on a configuration manager device. So we will just put an asterisk on that and come back to it in a little bit. So why do we care about anti-malware policies? Well, one reason is because these are the policies that will go out to your devices that are being managed with endpoint protection. And there is the concept of a default anti-malware policy, right? What this is, it's the default. And so if you enable endpoint protection to do anti-malware work in your environment, then it will have a default set of instructions that it will get implemented on it to know how to function, right? And so knowing that this default is out there, and the default means anytime you turn it on, it's going. You don't have to deploy it. You don't have to put it, associate it with a collection, nothing. It's just going straight out there to any device where endpoint anti-malware is enabled, right? And so you can take our default, you can modify our default to be more exactly what you want, and then you can have that be what goes out to devices. And in that case, if there's one that somehow your custom anti-malware policy doesn't arrive at, or falls in a different collection, or is excluded, or whatever the case may be, there will be an agreed upon standard for how your settings will be configured for anti-malware in your environment. Right? I already mentioned policy templates, so I'm going to show you where this is and where you can access it. Very flexible, fully customizable controls, customization for your policies, and so on. If you have a custom policy that you build, then it will override the default anti-malware policy wherever it's deployed. So whenever you build your custom, you will deploy those to a collection, and then when it arrives at the device, then whatever default policy might have been there will be superseded by the custom one, right? So some good, interesting reasons why we care about anti-malware policy. So what are the requirements for deploying and managing anti-malware policy? So I put endpoint protection agent. Certainly you need that, but I put a question mark there, right? Why do I put a question mark there? Because as of Configuration Manager 1802, Windows 10 devices do not need to have the endpoint protection agent installed. Let me clarify that statement a bit. So the endpoint protection agent is present on Windows 10. When you install, and Server 2016 forward, and so on, right? When you install the Configuration Manager client, part of that install would be to install the endpoint protection agent. And we would just do that whether it was needed or not in cases where it was already there. And so as of 1802, which is well in the rearview mirror as of this recording, we're not going to install it. We don't need to. It's already on Windows 10, so why would we install it again when it's already there, right? Now, if the endpoint protection agent is already installed on the device for some reason, like maybe it was put there before in a previous version of Config Manager and then you're reinstalling the client, then we're not going to remove it if it's already there. We're just going to leave it alone, but we just don't add it to Windows 10 machines as of version 1802. So that's important to understand. It's also important to understand the opposite of that. So on operating systems where we need it, so if you want to manage an operating system such as Server 2012, R2 maybe, yeah, we'll put it out there if we need it. If we are on a non-Windows 10 OS that needs it, yeah, we'll go ahead and put it out there. You also need, and we'll put it out there whenever you install the client, you also need the endpoint protection point. So this is a site system role, and you only install one. If you have a CAS, then you install it on the CAS. If you have a standalone primary, well, there's no choice. You install it at the standalone primary. And then you need anti-malware definitions available in your environment so that you can deploy them. So there's multiple pathways that you can use to deploy the latest anti-malware updates and definitions to your endpoint protection agent. Certainly you can do it manually. That sounds incredibly painful, so I would never want to do it manually except maybe for testing. These anti-malware definitions are updated 3 times a day, and so trying to keep them current in a manual fashion, that would be kind of painful and a lot of effort, right? Certainly you can use Config Manager software updates, and we will show that to you in this session. You can use something like WSUS or Microsoft Updates or the Microsoft Malware Protection Center or UNC or Intune, lots of options, right? In our context, we're talking about a management tool, in this case, Configuration Manager, and that's what we will focus on. Okay, so that said, let's talk about configuring this capability. So to do that, let me pull in the Configuration Manager virtual machine, and here it is. All right, and so we're going to immediately navigate to Administration, and then to Site Configuration, and then Servers and Site System Roles, right? So here, we're going to pick a existing or new, if you want to, system that will handle the endpoint protection point. So you see that I already have it here, right? Now, I could go down here and add it again. Let's just pretend like I don't have one. So add site system role. And then I'm going to click next and next. And well, I don't have it listed here. Probably maybe because I have it already installed, because I only need one. But I would normally pick it from the list. I could go through the wizard and off we go. But since I don't have it here, let me go look at the properties of the one that is installed. So here's my endpoint protection point. So if we look at properties, then one of the things I'm going to need to detail is what I want to do in terms of the cloud protection service. Right now, what is this thing called the cloud protection service? Effectively, the Cloud Protection Service is a worldwide online community that includes Microsoft Defender users And when you join, if you join the Cloud Protection Service, then Microsoft Defender, Windows Defender will automatically send information to Microsoft that will help us, in kind of working through different identification of malware situations and so on. So obviously you don't have to join it. You have your choice. Do not join, basic, advanced, whatever you would like. You can implement it. Is advantageous for us to have as much data as we can in making some of these anti-malware identification decisions and so on, but you don't have to do it. Now, once you install, you do need to install the endpoint protection point. Once you install that, you probably want to validate that it has been set up correctly. So if I go into my logs folder, there's a couple of logs I can look at. One is endpoint setup.log. And so this installed a while back. You can see installation is successful. So I'm good to go with the installation of it. Then also a couple of more. There's endpoint MGR. And this one basically will record the status of the endpoint protection site system role and whether we're operating healthy or whatever. And mine's in my lab, so it's not tremendously active. You can see that it's checking and polling every minute in some cases for different things, but I haven't done anything with it really endpoint protection there. Here's a little bit. Successfully read threats from an incoming file and different things. So this will tell you what's going on with your endpoint protection point. And then finally, endpoint protection control MGR here. So basically, this is going to record any details about the syncing of malware threat information from the endpoint protection role server and into the configuration manager database. So you can see current antivirus signature and different detail and so on about it. All right. So very useful logs for making sure that everything's working the way that you expect it would, and so. Okay, so now that we have that role installed and understood, so how would we go about dealing with anti-malware software updates that we might want to synchronize? Well, first of all, we've set up the endpoint protection point. That does not mean that we are synchronizing anti-malware software updates yet. We're going to need to do that. And so let's go look. First of all, actually, I've got mine configured, but let me show you where you would go and do that. Which one do I want to do first? Sometimes I don't like the way our documentation is organized. So if you go look at this in our documentation, it will take you directly to the automated deployment rules. So before we get there, though, you definitely need to have the appropriate configurations for the synchronization of these definition updates. So if I go to sites and then my site server, and then settings, software update point, or configure site component software update point, right? So the first thing I need to make sure is enabled is under classification, I need to have definition updates turned on. I do. And then also in products, and this is a little bit hard to find unless you exactly look for it, there's two pieces, System Center Endpoint Protection and then Microsoft Defender Antivirus that you might want. And so one would logically think that if you go straight down to System Center, that you would find it in that list, and you won't. So the System Center is under Forefront. So if you scroll down up to wherever you are, Forefront, then you're going to see System Center Endpoint Protection. So that's more for legacy-ish kind of update definitions and so on. And then if you look for Microsoft Defender Antivirus, one would logically assume you would go to the M's, but that's not true. You go to Windows, and then under Windows, you have Microsoft Defender Antivirus. And both of those are, in fact, selected. Now, you can validate that you are synchronizing the update definitions correctly by going to all software updates and then simply adding criteria of update definition or update classification, and then select definition updates under here and search, and you will limit your scope to only definition updates, and you can confirm they are there. Now, as I scroll up and down, you'll see a lot of red X ones, you'll see some yellow ones, some green ones as we go through. These do synchronize, as I mentioned, 3 times a day. And so it is pretty easy for you to see a bunch of expired things in your environment, which is, again, why having an automated way to deploy these is very helpful. Now, with that precursor, let's jump ahead to where I was going to go a moment ago, and that is automatic deployment rules. So here, I'm not going to spend much time here. I'm just going to walk through it really quickly. If you create an automatic deployment rules, this is actually a place where I absolutely would recommend that you have this because things move so quickly. You can supply the name. If you have a template that you already have, great. You have to choose a collection. I'll just pick one. That doesn't mean anything because I'm not going to finish this. And then here is a section, right? Add to existing software update group. So there will be so much churn that it makes the most sense to have a software update group that is dedicated to deploying definition updates, right? So on the next page, I'm going to leave that as it is. And so on the next page, basically, I need to make sure that, well, that's not the right one. So on the next page, here. So there's a couple of things that I need to set. So the first thing I'm going to do is set update classification. I'm going to need to have a filter for that. The other one is product. So I'm going to have a filter for that as well. So with each of those in the window, I'm going to click on items to find under update classification and filter to definition updates. And then under product, I'm going to click items to find, and I'm going to scroll down to system. Well, let's see which one comes first. AKL, Microsoft, Defender, antivirus. I'll click, and then also I'm going to go down to System Center Endpoint Protection and click on that one. Come on, go on down, Steve. System Center. I'm so paranoid I'm going to miss one from the previous screen. So here's the other one, right? And one thing you'll notice, probably have noticed, is these are listed in alphabetical order here. They are not listed in alphabetical order on the products page whenever you're configuring your software updates to sync, right? So this is a more friendly view than the other one, in my opinion. But either way, we have them set here. Now, if I want to validate that my settings are correct, I can always click on Preview, which will go out and pull a list of the updates that are covered by the given classification. Looks like this is taking a second. Here it comes. All right, and so we'll get a whole bunch of them showing in the list here, right? So that we have it good. Now, as we move to the next page of the wizard, we need to specify a recurring schedule for evaluating this. Now, you could have your time based on sorry, I'm getting distracted. So the schedule here is basically how often you want to run the rule here. And so this is something that synchronizes 3 times a day, as I mentioned, so not a bad idea to run the rule after the software update synchronization. We'll leave that alone. All right. And shifting down to the deployment schedule then would be as soon as possible is what I would choose. Now, you're going to find it documented that we suggest that you set it to 1 hour after the automated deployment rule is run. Right? I don't personally agree with that. I would set the install to be available right away. The thought behind the documentation is really to make sure that you have time to let the software updates make it to the distribution point and so on. I get that, right? But at the same time, you're going to have some randomization in some of that activity anyway, and so I would rather get it out there as soon as possible. Yeah, there may be a little bit of a time where you're failing and so on. But neither here nor there. You can make the choice that you feel like is appropriate for your environment. And then on the user experience, hide in Software Center. These updates or these definition updates are going to happen so frequently that disturbing the user with pop-ups and so on throughout the day that just the definition updates are out there doesn't make a lot of sense. These don't reboot the system, so really no need to even let the user know that these definition updates are happening, right? So you can hide those in Software Center. And then the last page of the wizard that I want to comment on for a minute is deployment package. So whenever you go to create an automated deployment rule, you choose whether you want to create a new deployment package, select one existing, whichever one you want is fine here. However, the general recommendation, these definition updates are going to change again quickly enough and need to get to your distribution points quickly enough that having a unique deployment package for these update definition makes a lot of sense. So I would have, if you're going to use Config Manager to deploy definition updates, then I would absolutely have them in a unique deployment package. These aren't huge. And so that way, whenever they get added to the deployment package, the distribution point will be updated. There won't be a tremendous amount of lag in getting that content out there. There's not going to be additional software update content that could be quite large. For example, our Windows 10 cumulative updates can be a couple of gig in size. You don't want that to be intermingled with your definition updates so that you don't have to wait on the larger ones to get to the distribution point first. So I would recommend a unique deployment package, right? Okay, so I'm going to close the wizard here. And the other element to talk about is making sure that you're aware of what's going on with your endpoint protection clients. And so that's done on the collection. So if you go to any collection, here I'm just going to use any collection, but in practice you would have a collection focused on deploying these updates. And so when you go to the properties of that collection and you go to the alerts tab, then you will have various alerts that you might want to add in. And so we have client status alerts. We have endpoint protection, malware detected alert. You're going to want to know about that. The same type of malware is detected on a number of computers. You're going to want to know about that. The same type of malware is repeatedly detected. You'll want to know about that. Multiple types of malware are detected. You'll want to know about that, right? So you don't have to, but a good idea to set up those alerts in your environment so you can be aware of malware outbreak and so on. Now, another item that you probably want to be aware of and interested in is if we are on a collection, we can just go on into this one and you'll see the devices that are in the collection. One of the columns that's not there by default is this anti-malware client version. So you can click on that, add it, and be able to track any kind of client version that might be out there. Scroll to the right, see what version it is, make sure that it is one that is currently the right version that you want, right? And if it's out of date, you can go ahead and find out why and possibly update it, whatever the case may be. There's also a column for anti-malware. I thought it was, oh wait, hang on a minute. Let's see. Did I miss it or am I forgetting something? Endpoint protection deployment state that you might want to have out there, right? And you'll be able to confirm that your devices are in fact managed. So this should be out there for you in your config manager infrastructure. Technically, it wasn't introduced until config manager 1702, but we're so far past that at the time of this recording that I can't imagine there are any environments still on 1702. So with all of this configured, then we can go to monitoring and look at our endpoint protection configurations here. Specifically, first, we'll start with alerts. So you had I just showed you where you could configure some alerts. So if you configured them, this is where they would show up. You could also configure email notification of the alert. So in this node, you would have any active alerts, all alerts, whatever. This is my lab, so not tremendously exciting, but still you see the ability here. And then under Endpoint Protection, I don't remember there's an Endpoint Protection node. Do we have, sorry, it's under Security. I don't remember if we have anti-malware under there or not. No, doesn't look like we do. Okay, cool. Actually, let's see. So malware detected, yeah, there we go. So we have some ability, and again, my lab's not very exciting, but we have the ability to see that malware is out there or not. And then the last thing, maybe it should have been more at the front of it. Either way, very, very, very important part is to go to client settings, and under client settings, enable endpoint protection. So just under default for me, I'm going to go to endpoint protection and enable endpoint protection. Then you have some options to install endpoint protection client on client computers. As mentioned, this is part of Windows 10, so I'm not going to even turn that on. But it's there that you want to turn that on. If you don't have that turned on, then you will have no success at all whenever you try to go through and set things up, right? Okay, oh, and sorry, I collapsed the config manager console. Now, with all of that precursor work, we are ready to configure anti-malware policy. So what I'm going to do is go to Assets and Compliance, and then at the bottom under Endpoint Protection, here, I have well, my screen will stay where I want it to be. I have anti-malware policy. So I have my default client anti-malware policy. You see it's there. You see that it's in order of precedence at the lowest level, because if there's anything that you want to customize ahead of that and have different policy, then we want that to take over. You see 0 deployments. I don't have a deployment because it is default. It's going to be applied to an enabled client if there's nothing else, right? So let's take a look at the default anti-malware policy, right? So I can go through here. You see that I have the ability to fully edit this, no problem, make changes. So if you scan through our default anti-malware policy and you don't want that to be your default setting, great, go ahead and change it to whatever makes the most sense, right? So here, I'm not going to go through every single one of these. A lot of this will be familiar. You have scheduled scans. You have scan settings and how you would like those to operate. You have default actions you would take in terms of detecting different severity of malware. You have real-time protection options that you can determine you want to enable or disable. You have exclusion settings, which are good to use. You can set those however you would like. Advanced settings that you can enable, threat overrides, and cloud protection service detail again, and security intelligence updates, right? How endpoint protection will receive security updates. So this is where you definitely want to configure your settings to match what you intend. In our case, we're using Configuration Manager as our source, and so this setting is relevant about using other sources if Config Manager's update can't be done for a certain period of time, and so on. Okay, so that's the default. Now, I just want to pop into custom for a minute, and specifically for one thing, right? So I mentioned a couple of times at the beginning that we have the ability to pull in templates. And so this is a security policy that is from that template. So let me show you what I mean. Well, first of all, let me show you the exclusion settings. So the key thing that I care about here, this is the config manager client template. And so if I look at this, I don't have to use these. You don't have to use these, but you can certainly see what we would recommend with our own anti-malware tool to be the exclusions, right? For operating with the configuration manager client. To get access to these, all I have to do is import a template, and it browses directly to exactly where the templates are located. You can kind of see it, the path there, and you see that we have 4 active. There's an archive folder, but we have 4 that are available and active. Here's the configuration manager one, and then beyond that we have the high security performance optimized and standard desktop that you can look at and evaluate. Again, up to you whether you use any of them, but certainly good to be able to evaluate and learn from and compare to what your own needs might be. All right. Okay. So once we have everything configured the way we want it, it's just simply a matter, I keep taking the computer out of the window, it's simply a matter of deploying these. So these right-click options have a deploy like you would expect in other places. Right, the right-click on the default does not have deploy because it is default, but you can see a deployment to a collection. I've got mine deployed to my Windows 10 systems collection. Deploying this is really not a big deal at all. All I click is deploy, brings up what collection I want, and that's really it. I choose the collection and off it goes, right? Okay. So that's walking through how to configure the anti-malware options, how to get things ready for deployment, and so on. Now that I've done that, let me show you that I just showed you that I have a customized anti-malware policy created. You see that I have it deployed. I don't know if it's actually on the device yet or not. It doesn't matter. But I do want to bring in the config manager client and show you a bit about, well, if I can get the VM to stay up, we'll bring in the config manager client. There we go. Right, and show you that it actually is there. So I want to start with the logs. Okay, so if I open up the logs here, then I do have an endpoint protection log right here, right? And so if I open that up and then I search in the log, find, there's just a couple of entries that might be of interest. So endpoint, instead of just scrolling, protection workload. So here's one that might be, let me maximize this. So endpoint protection is one of those things that can either be shifted to Intune or in a co-managed environment, or it can be managed by configuration manager. So this is a check to make sure, hey, is this shifted to Intune? If not, config manager is going to apply the policy and we are good to go, right? Another one that might be informative, policy group lose, right? Here's just a list of different settings that might be coming down and so on, signature updates and so on that you can follow and make sure are tracking the right way for your environment. Another one that might be interesting for us to see, and this is probably the last one, I don't want to just sort through here again and again, but policy deployment result, right? So this is an XML that will kind of show you the different configurations that are out there and so forth, right? Okay, so those are definitely deployed to the client, or that is the log where you can track what is deployed. And then also in that log, you can ultimately see which particular anti-malware policy is being delivered to the device, and so on. And so, not difficult, pretty easy to follow how this all works in terms of troubleshooting tips and tricks. Not a ton to add to what I've already shared with you. It's pretty straightforward. The logs that I've shown you how to track everything that's going on. Definitely test. Definitely make sure that your anti-malware policies are out there and doing what you expect. I have seen, one thing I'll say, I have seen in some cases one customer that was using 3 anti-malware products on their device, and obviously that's not going to be a friendly environment. You can have these products conflicting and fighting with each other and so on. So, be intentional about how we deploy these settings and so on. But that's really the end of what I wanted to share with you in this session. So we will wrap this one and we will see you next time.